So hi everybody, welcome to the second July MarSocSci webinar. And for those who haven't attended a webinar and don't know anything about MarSocSci or me, I'm Emma McKinley. I'm a research fellow at Cardiff University and I'm the founder and chair of the Marine Social Science Network. MarSocSci is a global community that's trying to raise the profile and have conversations about marine social sciences, but also be as interdisciplinary and as inclusive as we can. So we cover a really broad brush set of topics, and as researchers and practitioners involved in lots and lots of different themes of work that are involved in the network. We have been running webinars for about a year now, so if you've missed any of them or you have to leave early today or anything like that, they're all being recorded and they're all available on our YouTube channel and also on our website, which you can find at marsocSci.net. I will pop some of this in the chat shortly. Just kind of some housekeeping, because this is set up as a webinar, all of your microphones are off, all of your cameras are switched off, so please do kind of still interact with us through the chat function and through the Q&A boxes. You're all very used to Zoom at this stage, so we'd really love it to be an interactive session. And as I said, as people are starting to join, Lou has already said that if you're happy to come on as a panelist to make this more of an interactive meeting at the end of the session for the discussion panel, then please do let us know in the chat and I can change that role for you, and then we can bring you on. Just bear in mind that you will be being recorded and that will go onto our YouTube channel, so you know that's completely your decision. There's no pressure either way. So with no further ado, I'd like to really very warmly welcome Dr Luciana Esteves from Bournemouth University. I should know that it's BU, not the other way around, given I'm a BU graduate. Lou is here to talk to us about integrated assessments of social vulnerability and coastal exposure, and has sent a paper around for us to think about in advance, and is going to draw on that recent publication that she's worked on with colleagues in this presentation today. I'm going to put the link for the paper into the chat box so you can open that up if you'd like to during today's session. And also, as a heads up, there will be some audience participation required, so Lou is going to get us working during this session, and again I'll make sure that those details are in the chat box as well. So Lou, I'm going to hand over to you. We can see your slides. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for inviting me to give this webinar. I think we are all looking forward to those times when we can really meet in person again and do these things, you know, being able to talk and see everyone. But also it's a great thing that allows everyone to just take that 1 hour of their time during the day and come and join us. So thank you for joining us today. There are two things I'd like to discuss with you today, really. One is talk about integrated assessments of social vulnerability coastal exposure, and hear your views about what you think this type of work or this type of assessment might be useful for, and whether we have given enough attention on how this type of work can be applied. As Emma says, I'm associate professor in physical geography at Bournemouth University. I am an oceanographer by background, but more and more throughout the last probably 10 years, I've been working on the boundaries of disciplines, really. And my focus of work is always coastal areas. So I've been working with the physical side and the social aspects as well, bringing the two things together. So today, I would like first to setting some discussion points for you to think about while I'm presenting the paper. Then I'm going to, of course, use the paper that was recently published. Is a joint authorship with Kari Ballesteros, that she was a postdoc at Bournemouth, and myself. And this paper focused on East Africa. And then after that, most of the time really is going to be, or I hope it's going to be, an interactive discussion on those sort of questions we are raising now. And as you can see there in the outline, I have a few questions for you that will help us guide the discussions later on. So if you can go to www.menti.com and then add that code, that number that you see there on the screen. And I will ask Emma to put that on the chat if possible, and people can access it. So you can I would like you to answer those questions before I start talking about the paper. So if you can take a few minutes to answer those questions now, then we can go and see those answers, your answers later on to help the discussion. Right, so let's see if this works here. Now my screen is stuck. That's very typical.
It wouldn't be a 2021 webinar without something.
Yeah.
It worked a second ago.
Yeah, I know, it did. Maybe it's the heat. It doesn't like the heat. Let's see. Do you still see my full screen?
No, we've got your PowerPoint kind of screen now.
Okay. Now it works. Brilliant.
Perfect. Yeah.
So the discussion is mainly about, is this type of work an academic exercise, or is it really useful for policy decision making? So when I was helping Kari write the paper, that was the paper that we are going to talk about in a minute, it was very clear to me that lots of paper that present this type of work about cost of vulnerability indicators or indices, they claim that those results are useful to inform disaster risk reduction, coastal planning and management, climate change adaptation, and so on and so on. However, very few of those papers really present evidence of actual application or discuss how the results can be applied in practice. So we decided that we were going to spend some more time to bring those sort of potential applications of our results into our paper. And so we have a very large discussion section. And I started thinking about, so is it just an issue of the literature? So it might be that those works, they are really used in practice, but nobody wrote about the applications. Maybe, I don't know, I want to see your responses to the questions in Mentimeter first, and then we can discuss my own views of that. So what I would like is, using that paper we published as a backdrop to discuss those things, right? So let's talk about the integrated assessment, how to bring together cost exposure and social vulnerability. So the biophysical aspects and the social aspects. And also, how could we make this type of work more useful or more applicable? So the Mentimeter covers pretty much the questions that you see on the screen now in one way or the other. And these are the questions that I would like to discuss with you later on. So are these assessments useful? Are they used in practice? If yes, why we don't read about those applications in the literature? And why we don't find that information in the literature? Then can we identify particular applications or particular characteristics, I mean, of this type of work that would make it more or less applicable? Maybe there is a disconnect between the academic work and the actual needs. So what are your thoughts? So this is what I would like you to think about while we are discussing the paper. So the next thing is about the paper. There's integrated assessment of social vulnerability cost exposure in East Africa. And I want to say beforehand that this work was not prompted by users or practitioners. So it came from us as part of a research project. And we think that there's great potential for practical application of this work, and that is one of the reasons why we want that discussion to happen. So the index of vulnerability to coastal change, so that's the integrated assessment. IVCC, was produced integrating a social vulnerability index and an index of exposure. And that covers 4 countries in East Africa: Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, and Madagascar. 3 of those countries are least developed countries, and Kenya is lower middle income country. So they are among the top 10 recipients of international aid in Africa. And we use the results to identify areas of priority concern in the region, in critical areas of priority concern, and you find out about those in a minute. So that's the paper. The paper was produced within the Rising from the Depths project that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council through the Global Challenge Research Fund. And as probably some of you might know, UKRI has sort of terminated the Global Challenge Research Fund and other types of research funds that come from international aid money. So this project is finishing. It got some extension due to COVID and is going to be finishing in January. And this project involves archaeologists, anthropologists. I covered this part of the coastal risks in coastal vulnerability. So the motivation for this work in a project that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council is because we are looking at Rising from the Depths, looks to use how to maximize the use of marine and coastal cultural heritage to promote sustainable living in East Africa. And of course, East Africa has a very rich coastal and marine cultural heritage, and also is one of the world's coastal areas most sensitive to natural hazards and climate change impacts, because of the impacts of cyclones in that region, and also high levels of vulnerability and low adaptive capacity in those countries. So we think that we thought that we needed to look at, what areas are more exposed and what areas perhaps should be prioritized in terms of the concern about protecting that cultural heritage, because cultural heritage is a finite asset. So if you lose it, you cannot recover. So that's the issue of, not the issue, but that is the motivation that we had to do a coastal vulnerability assessment as part of a project looking to promote cultural and marine cultural heritage. So these are some of our research questions. What are the locations most exposed? Are they affecting the most socially deprived people or areas? We also know from other research we are doing that that area has high, well, has still lots of natural habitats still there, but these natural habitats are threats from overharvesting and coastal development. So how would losing that habitat affect exposure to coastal hazards in that area? So we think about what are the implications of having exposure to coastal hazards and social vulnerability together. Are these important cultural heritage? Are they in areas that are highly exposed? Are they in areas that have high poverty? And also, what is the sort of investment in the regions that are more affected by by coastal hazards. So for example, in East Africa now, there are lots of port expansions, investment in infrastructure and roads and so on. So are these investments being made in areas that are at high risk currently, right? So these are some of the concerns that we had when we started looking at this, this sort of work. So what we really did was find methods to develop an index of exposure, find methods to develop a social vulnerability index, and how to integrate those two things. And that is what we called in our work integrated index of vulnerability to coastal change, because it involves both biophysical and social indicators. So we also looked at the population at higher exposure levels within 5 kilometers of the shoreline, and we looked also at the role of natural habitats in reducing exposure. So what we are doing here, really, we are not looking at impacts of climate change. We are trying to assess what's the current situation. As a bit of background of the index of exposure, the method we used has been already applied at different scales, at local level, subnational level, and national level. And the ones that you see there marked in magenta, they are works that have also included some measures of social vulnerability, mainly age groups, and some others, like the one in China, have actually used a lot of different indicators to combine biophysical and social vulnerability. So the index of exposure that we use to the INVEST model, you can use 7 different indicators. Geomorphology, that we actually changed, instead of geomorphology, rough categorizations as a proxy to how susceptible that coastal typology is to change. We have actually used shoreline change rates. Then relief, of course, topography, wave exposure, wind exposure, surge potential, and the coastal protection offered by natural habitats. We have not used the relative sea level change rates because we didn't have enough data that would be meaningful to apply across the region to create like differences in exposure. So that's the equation that the model uses to, the model uses rankings, right? So the R that you see in that equation means ranking. And the next slide shows how those rankings are defined. Oh, sorry, the next slide, we'll see the rankings. Here is the sources of data that we have used for the different indicators of index of exposure. And we have used mainly global data because we needed to use data that would be comparable across the 4 countries. And this, of course, is a big issue in terms of which sort of data we could actually use in this work. Then these are the rankings for the INVEST model. So pretty much what is the model, the default values is you divide the range of values you have for each indicator, and it's divided in 5 quantiles. So the lower values, the lower 20% of the values are considered very low exposure, and the top 20% of values are considered very high exposure, and so on. But we have done some modifications in terms of the relief and in terms of the wave exposure, because we thought that would reflect better the actual level of exposures in those locations. And as I said, we didn't use geomorphology, we use shoreline change rates, and these are the rates of change that we use to fit in each category. So what the model does is it produces those values, then those values are transformed into the rankings, and that equation that you see in a couple of slides back, that produces the average ranking for the area that you are looking, you are assessing. Then the social vulnerability applies similar methods, but with social vulnerability indicators. So we used 8 commonly used indicators that are commonly used, especially in the context of least developed countries or developing countries. And we did some transformations there to normalize those values. And these are the data sets that we have used, mainly census data from Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. The census data for Madagascar was quite old, was from 1993. So we decided that would not be comparable to the other ones. And we have not then calculated social vulnerability index for Madagascar. So our data concerning Madagascar is only related to the exposure. So we used population age groups, population growth, education levels, housing standards, and sanitation. And these are indicators commonly used to reflect social vulnerability. Okay, so some highlights there on the results of exposure. So 22% of East Africa's shoreline length is at higher exposure. So higher exposure means high and very high rankings, okay? And that means that about 3.5 million people within 5 kilometers of the shoreline are at higher levels of exposure to coastal hazards. Mozambique has the largest population at higher exposure. It's about 1.6 million people. Madagascar has the largest proportion of the shoreline length at higher exposure. There's about 30-something% or 20-something% in current levels at 23%. So these are the percentages of the shoreline at higher risk in each country. So you can see that Madagascar has the largest proportion, followed by Mozambique. But Mozambique has the largest population at higher exposure. And these are the provinces that are more are at the highest levels of exposure in terms of proportion of the coastline at higher exposure. So you see that province at in the south of Madagascar, 82% of its shoreline is at higher, very high levels of exposure. And you see the contrast. So these are the provinces that are most exposed in each country. You see, in contrast, in Tanzania, Pwani is the province more exposed. It has only 25% of its shoreline at higher exposure levels. So we categorized the level of, well, we defined as exposed areas, either at the level of province or districts. So districts are an element of provinces. Provinces are larger areas. If 50% or more of their shoreline was exposed in ranking 4 or 5, high or very high, we consider that they were exposed areas, right? And we considered critically exposed areas if more than 90% of their shoreline was at higher exposure. So we have 27 exposed districts, and we have 8 critically exposed districts. And I guess you can appreciate that this was because, well, if you have 90% of your shoreline very exposed to coastal hazards, whatever you do in whatever part of that shoreline is at risk of something, flooding or erosion or wind or high winds or something like that. So you have to be very cautious on what you do in those areas. So this data represents current conditions. So it's already of serious concern. And if you lose habitat, because a habitat produces or offers natural coastal protection, if you lose habitat, then of course you're going to aggravate the conditions in terms of you will increase exposure, or you might increase exposure, and you're going to see that in a minute. So it's important to emphasize that these results are relative measures. So any indication of low or high exposure or social vulnerability is solely in relation to the other locations within that region. So it means that, for example, if we say an area in Tanzania is of lower exposure, that means lower exposure in relation to other areas in East Africa. But if you look at Tanzania only, it might be that that area might be at higher levels of exposure within Tanzania. Okay, so it's not an absolute value, it's in relation to what happens in that region. And of course, if we get different data, we might get different results, but the data we have used, we are very confident they are the best available to use at that scale. So some of the results here are the effects of habitat loss. So what we've done here, and I should do that, what we have done here is that we have run the model using 5 scenarios. The current presence of habitats, what would happen if we lose our corals, what would happen if you lose our mangrove, what would happen if you lose our seagrasses, and what happens if you lose our coastal habitats. And we've done that to assess the level of protection offered by each one of those natural habitats. Okay, so when you see with habitats, that would be our scenario 1. And when you see without habitats, that's our scenario 5, when you lose our habitats. So that's, of course, is not something that we expect is going to happen, but it's just a way of assessing the level of protection that those coastal habitats offer. And you can see there that losing our habitats will almost double the proportion of shoreline length at higher exposure in East Africa, and also the population. Now, in different countries, that change is different. You see that Tanzania currently is the least exposed country, and we will see in a minute also that it is the least vulnerable or social vulnerable country. But if you lose habitats, the exposure will increase 3 times. In Kenya, if you lose habitats, exposure will increase 2.5 times. It means the length of the shoreline that will be considered exposed, okay, or a high and very high exposure. Now, in terms of population, look that Kenya will have a 4-fold increase in the population exposed to those higher levels. Okay, and Tanzania even more will increase 5 times. So Tanzania, if due to habitat loss in those very unlikely scenarios, would have the largest increase in population at higher exposure and would become the country with the largest population highly exposed. And Kenya would become the country with the highest proportion of shoreline at high and very high levels of exposure. So, of course, all this is spatially variable, this effect of the natural habitats, because you have the mangroves dominating some areas, seagrasses dominating other areas, and corals dominating other areas. So that's variable. So mangroves contribute to coastal protection along 60% of the East Africa coastline. Coral reefs protect along 34% of coastlines, and both together protect about 18% of the East Africa coastline. Now, coral reefs protect a larger number of people, and therefore losing corals would put a larger proportion of people, a large number of people in at higher levels of exposure. And this is pretty much what you see here, where here you have the different scenarios. So in here, for example, is the population at higher exposure if you lose all mangroves. So the difference to the scenario of all habitats is very small. Now, if you look at this scenario here, that is with corals are lost, you see that the jump in number of people at higher levels of exposure is quite large. Okay, so that is what this graph is showing. Now, in terms of districts, so that's the smaller administrative levels, what changes happen if you lose natural habitat? So you have here current situation, and then if you lose our habitats, the number of districts that become more than 50% of the shoreline at higher exposure. And these ones are the ones that have more than 80% of its shoreline at high exposure, and these ones are the critically exposed, so 90% or more. So you have, currently you have 9. If you lose habitats, you have 13, and they are showing in those arrows there. The purple ones are the 90% ones, and the darker purple ones and the magenta ones are the 80% of shoreline at high exposure. Now, these are the results of the social vulnerability index. In darker, the color, the shades here, indicates, of course, higher levels of social vulnerability. We don't have the data from Madagascar because of the census data being too old. And what we see here is that Mozambique has the highest average social vulnerability level, Tanzania the lowest social vulnerability level. And the same thing goes for the combined index of vulnerability to coastal change, the combined social vulnerability and coastal exposure. So we have 20 coastal districts with the highest levels of social vulnerability, 17 in Mozambique and 3 in Kenya. Okay. Now, we consider that, of course, because the rankings are based on values 1, very low, to 5, very high. The maximum IVCC that you can have is 10. And we consider that areas with values above 7 would be considered areas of priority concern. So that means that there, to have that value, you need to have moderate exposure and moderate social vulnerability, or you might have at least one of those be high or very high. So at current conditions, of course, we have, and I have to draw attention here, the changes between the scenarios there is only about the exposure, because we didn't make projections of how the socioeconomics on those countries would change. So what we are considering in terms of change here is just exposure if we lose habitats. So we have here the current situation in this column, and this column here, the number of districts that will increase to be, well, if we lose habitats. So what's perhaps important here is that how many of those districts that are socially vulnerable are also critically exposed, because what we are concerned here is that are vulnerable people highly exposed. So if you have high social vulnerability and you have a large proportion of the shoreline at high and very high levels of exposure, then these areas are really priority concern. Now imagine if you have 90% of that shoreline at very high or high levels of exposure, then we consider those areas as critical areas of priority concern. And we have 4 in Mozambique, and perhaps 4 to 6 in Madagascar. We don't know because we don't have the social data for Madagascar, but that is what we assume based on what we know of exposure and what we expect to find in terms of social vulnerability. Now, interrogating the data, this is sort of the data that we can go at very, very different levels. So, for example, the level exposure is assessed every 1 kilometer along the coastline, and the social vulnerability data is the minimum area we could find that are comparable across the countries would be the district level. Okay, so what we have here, I selected those 4 districts that are critical areas of priority concern because they have IVCC above 7, and they have more than 90% of their shoreline critically exposed. They are 90% of their shoreline, yes, higher, very high exposure levels. So this is what you see here. This is the average ranking for those districts, with the red being the exposure level and the blue being the social vulnerability level. So you see that they are all very highly socially vulnerable, and they have moderate to high levels of exposure in terms of average ranking. Here is the population exposed. So thankfully, none of those districts have a lot of people at higher levels of exposure. And this is the sort of data that we have for the indicators of course, the ranking. I mean, it's not, we have the values as well, the actual values, but these are the rankings. So for wind, wave, surge, relief, erosion, and then the presence of habitats. 5 is very high exposure, so it means that indicator contributes a lot for the level of exposure. Yeah, for example, Zavala here, you have ranking 5, so the highest values for wind, wave, and habitat. It means it doesn't have a lot of habitats protecting the coastline. In this situation, you see in quite a few of those districts. So if you are intending to do something about it, perhaps that is what you have to consider. How would you reduce the effects of wind and wave? And how would you preserve the habitats that are there, or restore habitats that have been lost? And these are the social vulnerability indicators. So you have the proportion of population less than 4 years old, more than 65 years old, housing standards. That means houses that are made of natural materials like mud or palm leaves, wood, and stuff like that. Unimproved sources of water, unimproved sanitation, population growth, illiterate rate, and then population density. Now, we have looked at heritage sites. Of course, Rising from the Depths is the project is concerned about cultural heritage. So we have a look at a smaller spatial area and looked at the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in East Africa and looked at how they fare. So what you have here is social vulnerability here in this red column, in the indicators, in the indicators of exposure for the different scenarios. And here you have the indicators of exposures for the current scenario of the presence of habitats. And you see that Ilha de Mozambique is where you have this fortress there, that's the UNESCO Heritage Site. And you have high social vulnerability, ranking 4, and you have quite higher levels of exposure of wind, wave, and surge. So this is sort of things that you can do with the data we have. In terms of applying the, now what do you do with this data? Of course, we have an idea of how you can use this data, and we think it's very urgent that this data is used in practice in East Africa because of the fast social environmental changes that are occurring in the region. So we can identify factors contributing to exposure and social vulnerability in different levels of country, region, country, province, and district. We can identify areas of priority concern or areas where you should look further in more detail at local characteristics to identify perhaps mitigating measures or adaptation measures. We can identify areas where nature conservation must be a priority. So natural levels of coast protection are maintained. We can identify where nature-based solutions might be particularly important, for example, to restore habitats that have been lost, or create habitats or space for habitats that could offer that natural protection. We can identify where efforts can benefit the most vulnerable people, and we can also direct well, international aid to areas that will benefit the most vulnerable, or will perhaps create more benefit in terms of reducing exposure. And of course, we know that whatever we do now will affect what we have, the issues that we have in the future. And I emphasize again that we are not looking at impacts of climate change or changes in socioeconomics. We are just assessing the current situation. So I said that we had the concern about going in more, to spend more time to talk about the applications. And perhaps I extracted a couple of things from our discussion on potential applications that we think that could be useful, this type of data could be used for. For example, to alert that investments are made in areas of high risk. For example, we know that there are large port expansions, there are new tourist developments happening in East Africa. So if we talk about port expansion, for example, Tomazina in Madagascar and Bagamoyo are two examples I'm going to mention. These expansions are in areas of high exposure, you might compromise their ability to actually bring the economic benefits to those countries because of impacts of climate change and in the conditions of current situation in terms of effects of cyclones. Not what was in 2019, there was that effect of the two cyclones close together affecting north coast of Mozambique, for example, and affect Beira, one of the areas that has a port expansion going on. So in Tomazina in East Madagascar currently is at high levels of exposure, and mainly due to wave and wind exposure that are very high concerns in terms of climate change impacts. Coral reefs are already at a very high risk from local threats, and the loss of corals would make this district a critical area of priority concern. So by knowing that, we know that those ports need to incorporate some adaptation plans that can manage those exposures, right? We don't know about social vulnerability because we don't have the data, but if we have that, we can identify perhaps what impacts that port development might cause in the social dynamics and whether this is benefiting or not the most vulnerable. That is one of the things we can say about Bagamoyo in Tanzania, is that perhaps some investments will affect more the vulnerable people. In this case here, Bagamoyo has a relatively higher proportion of elderly people than other coastal districts in East Africa. So if you have this port development there, perhaps more young, skilled people will come from outside areas, and this will shift the local demographics, and you have perhaps a false improvement in social indicators that would reflect reduction in social vulnerability. But in essence, what you are doing there, perhaps you are reducing the chances of employment for some disadvantaged groups like the elderly, women, or maybe local youth that are less skilled, leading to increased marginalization or displacement of those groups of people. So identifying and resolving these issues, of course, require a more localized understanding of the issues, but this type of data can point you in the right direction where to prioritize efforts. And in terms of nature conservation, for example, in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, in Zanzibar, in Mombasa, coral reefs protect 1.8 million people. So we'd think, let's protect those coral reefs that are in there to maintain that level of protection. You don't want to increase exposure to that number of people. In a district in Kenya, Kilifi South, loss of habitat. Currently, there is no area there that is at higher levels of exposure. But if you lose habitats, 92% of the shoreline will become highly exposed, bringing 95,000 people at these higher levels of exposure. So perhaps creating a marine national reserve or extending the one that exists further south to this area in the north will help protect those corals and maintain that level of exposure to low levels. So that there is a range of things that we can identify could be used with this data, and we just want to know what you think about how this data could be used. So now, Emma, this is what I wanted to say, really, and I would love to hear comments from people, questions, and while this come through, I can have a look at the Mentimeter and see what the results there are.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lou. A fascinating talk, and for me, I think really highlights the importance of taking that interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach to when we're thinking about coastal management. You know, it's not going to be one set of data. We need to understand so many different complex dynamics that are impacting coastlines across the world. And there were some quite shocking figures that you showed in some of your data, like when you think about the exposure and the level of potential risk that some of these communities are going to be at potentially in the future in response to climate change, and the need to think about how we support adaptive capacity and resilience across a range of different factors. And I took quite a lot from that around, you know, what we mean by social vulnerability. I think some of the points you made at the end around displacement and capacity building and skills within communities, I think really speak to a number of us working within the MarSocSci community. So for me, that was great. Thank you so much. If anybody's got any questions for Lou, please feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A box. I will keep an eye on those. We've got about 10 minutes left, Lou, so I don't know if you want to have a look or talk through any of the Mentimeter findings. I had a couple of questions that I'd written down as we were going, so while we're waiting for other people, I can post those to you.
Sure.
My first, I'm just going back, I had a few during it. My first thing that I wrote down was whether, I think you probably answered this later on, but just whether there'd been any consideration of different dimensions of social vulnerability. So I know you mentioned about the economics and you know, that you had to use particular types of data. So I appreciate that it maybe wasn't considered in your models, but when you're thinking about ideas of well-being and the kind of more, I don't know, harder to measure aspects of well-being, how might that fit in? Has there been any consideration given to that within the work that you've been doing?
Now, think about in this country, Emma, how would you find this data, right?
Yeah.
And how sparse that might be. And now think about the situation in East Africa and working across 4 countries. So in our concern was, can we find even basic data that can be comparable, right? So in our situation for that work, it was just simply not something we could even consider. And I think in East Africa, even what is well-being? Yeah,
of course. I mean, you might use a different term.
Yes, So you know, that is something that, of course, if you are looking at a more localized assessment, and you are looking at a data-rich situation, you should include. And actually, one of the reviewers of this paper did mention something similar, you know, so why don't you include this and that? And the answer was that, you know, because that data doesn't exist in that context, you know, and so it's important, but you have to put into the context. So the choice of indicators for assessments like this require being available across the whole region in comparable ways. Otherwise you're creating disparity there, and that is something. So one of the questions there, I have Mentimeter here. I could let me see. Let me
if you can share it.
Let me just see if I can share that. Start sharing again. Now I lost where the sharing things are. I cannot find it.
Oh, you should have a green button.
Yeah.
There.
Nope.
Oh.
I should have, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it. Mm-hmm.
While you're getting ready, oh, there, perfect. Oh, I can see myself. That's always a joy. I totally appreciate that. I mean, I guess it was more how you guys had dealt with that issue, because I appreciate that the kind of the issues around data availability and consistency and comparability that you set out quite clearly at the beginning of the talk was really key. I guess it was more just how you'd had those conversations within the project. I love the reviewer said it as well.
Yeah,
I wasn't the reviewer, I promise.
no problem. Actually, it was interesting. I don't know whether others attending here have the same issue, but this paper was quite difficult to get it reviewed. We sent to one journal, and then said, no, we are only accepting now 10% of whatever submissions. We are passing it to a different journal. Okay, great. Then that journal, after I think 2-3 months, came back to us saying, we contacted 12 reviewers and none said they were available or able to review. So we went to a third journal, and finally we got some reviewers there. I don't know whether it was a COVID thing that people were too busy and didn't want to review, or it was the context of the paper, East Africa integrating, biophysical and social. I don't know what's the case, but it was quite an interesting experience, let's say. So what comes to mind when you hear about coastal vulnerability, threat of displacement, sea level rise, coastal flooding, adaptation, exposure sensitivity, coastal erosion, climate change, lack of preparity, threat of flooding, erosion. So vulnerability, when we think, you see, if you work in natural environments, you think about erosion, you think about flooding, climate change impacts and stuff like that. Perhaps if you work more in the socioeconomic side, you talk about displacement, you talk about vulnerable people, you talk about the threats to livelihoods. So it's the same thing, it's just we focus in different aspects of vulnerability. And when you start working on this area, you see how different the terminology and the wording is in works that were written by someone from the social science, in the works that were written by someone from the more, risk to erosion and flooding, or the physical side of things. And coastal vulnerability, for example, for someone that works with erosion and flooding, will be related to biophysical things. Coastal vulnerability for someone that works in socioeconomics or the human dimension will be more about the livelihoods, the displacements, the sources of will they be able to live in their area, or will they survive in their area, and so on. So it's same problem seen from different perspectives. So what should be included in coastal vulnerability assessments? Social connections, in how they might be impacted, public attitudes toward climate change in their local area. So that's a very interesting point. Lots of heritage and culture, physical, biological, cultural, socioeconomic components. So everything, that's true, it's everything.
All of the things.
Yeah. Community well-being, of course, coastal vulnerability index for sea level rise, land subsidence. Yeah. So it's not an easy task, is it? Are we ever going to be able to do something that's really an absolute measure in terms of vulnerability? My answer would be no. We can do relative things using a limited number of indicators, but does that answer our questions? No, and anything that's trying to answer that question is a definite, answer. I think it's questionable, but we need to do something to answer some of the questions, right? So public attitudes towards climate change this is very important, because that defines their adaptation or adaptability levels. Yes. But that changes according to context. Public attitudes here in the UK is one, or many within the country. You go to East Africa, it's very different.
Yeah.
So I know we are reaching the end. So yes, so that's it. Okay, yes. So the literature doesn't cover vulnerability assessments in practice. Only one paper I found that actually talks about application in practice, and that was in the Bahamas. And the paper was actually written by people working for the government in the Bahamas. So can we make those information usable?
Do you think that's down to a publication bias towards, you know, I think there's been a move, I was speaking to somebody about this earlier today actually, that there's been a real shift away from publishing case studies, and people want to, now the journals want to see, and I do it myself sometimes as a reviewer, I kind of say, okay, well, what's the bigger picture implications of this? Like, I get this case study is really important, it's really, really valuable, but what does it mean for wider coastal management? And I wonder if that's part of the challenge and part of why we don't see some of that applied work, because from an academic perspective, for those, you know, depending on where your research excellence framework or whatever it might be in whatever country, you know, if your metrics are for highly conceptual, highly theoretical, big global studies, I wonder if that's part of it, that it's just a publication bias, and we need to do, I completely agree that we need to do more to ensure that that information gets out, because we need to see how these things work in practice. And particularly when you're talking about something that, I mean, essentially what we're saying is that we can't have all the data, we can't answer all of our questions, but we need to make some decisions. So therefore our governance structures have to be adaptive and flexible to be able to respond to new information and to more data as it comes in and to changing circumstances. And we need to be able to see how people are doing that and how they're applying that. So, I mean, I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's a really important conversation to be having around how we make this sort of information accessible.
Which journals will accept it. And the thing is, you know, we've done this work, the project ended, you know, are you going to return to it? If ever it gets used in practice, are you going to return to it? How?
Yeah, definitely one of the challenges. Well, thank you so much, Lou, for such a fascinating talk. I really, really enjoyed it. It was brilliant to have something that was so interdisciplinary and bring in so many different perspectives. I found it really, really, yeah, just fascinating to see all the work you've done, and it's such a different global context as well, geographical context, from some of the presentations we've had so far. So thank you very, very much. If anybody would like a copy of the paper, get in touch. You've got the link in the chat, but get in touch with me. If you'd like to get in touch with Lou to answer any other questions, because I know we have run out of time, but if you would like to be put in touch with her, again, just get in touch if you didn't manage to jot down her email address. The recording will be made available, and Lou, I'll share that with you soon, probably today or tomorrow, and we can share that widely. And thank you all so much. There'll be another MarSocSci webinar in the next few weeks. We've not decided when yet. We might take August off. I hope you all stay cool. It is very warm, and have wonderful summers. Lou, thank you again so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And nice. Thank you everybody for joining us, and take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.